Hello and welcome to Dialogues once again. You're watching Worldview with me, Vishal Dahiya. Now, this week we're going to talk about the NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Of course, the NATO partners, the countries, did hold a summit, the NATO summit recently. And the key highlight of that summit after the meeting was over was the fact that all the NATO partners agreed to go ahead and expand or rather increase the defense budget, the money which is spent by these countries on their defense budgets and the contribution towards the overall NATO defense budget as well. And the increase is pretty substantial, up to 5% by 2035, but around 1.5% of it will be gradual. That's one part of it. But the other part is that in the given situation, in the present geopolitical situation, how clearly are the goals aligned for all these NATO member countries, the European nations, the United States of America, and let's not forget other NATO countries like Turkey as well. So we'll take a closer look in today's episode and try and understand and analyze as to does NATO still stands together on almost everything, specifically with respect to Russia and other geopolitical issues, or the differences within NATO, if at all there are, then what kind of those differences are and how deep those differences can be in the near future also. And for more on this, we're joined by two distinguished experts. Let me first introduce them to you, beginning with former Ambassador Prabhu Dayal, who is joining us, and Captain Alok Bansal, Director, India Foundation, is also with us. Both of you gentlemen, welcome to Worldview once again. Let me start with you, Ambassador Dayal, and let's start by an overview as well. The real simple question is, has the internal dynamics of the NATO changed drastically or just changed semantically?
Well, Vishal, first of all, thanks for having me on your show. US President Donald Trump has brought about some changes in regard to US policy about NATO. You would recall that he had repeatedly threatened to withdraw US forces from Europe as part of his America First policy. He had also declared that he was not going to protect NATO members that were spending too little on their defense. Therefore, there were anxieties amongst European NATO members that if the US withdrew from NATO, it would have enormous strategic consequences, and Russia would be emboldened to be more aggressive towards its European neighbors. In this background, I think there are four important takeaways which I would like to point out from the recent NATO summit in The Hague. The first takeaway is the big hike in defense spending. NATO members have committed to a 5% increase, and this will be reached within a decade. It's a remarkable jump from the current 2% guideline, which isn't met by 8 NATO members out of the 32. Now, Trump had said on his campaign trail last year that if a country did not pay its dues to NATO, then he would not protect that country. Now, Trump has gone back to Washington with a deal that means all other member states have agreed to increase their NATO spending, which is what he wanted. The second takeaway is that there are some important signals about how things are changing. The recent NATO summit communique is much shorter and its language is much weaker as compared to previous summits. Now, the statement issued after last year's NATO summit in Washington had stated that Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine has shattered peace and stability in the Euro-Atlantic area and gravely undermined global security. It had also said that Russia remains the most significant and direct threat to the Allies' security. In contrast, this recent declaration at the NATO summit in The Hague does not mention the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Again, while the NATO summit held in Washington last year under President Joe Biden had produced a declaration that mentioned Ukraine 59 times, this year's much shorter declaration has only 2 mentions of Ukraine. It was clear that the NATO leadership would play a deferential role to the US President Donald Trump, who has for years embraced Putin and sharply criticized Zelensky. Two other quick points. The third major takeaway, which is important from the point of view of the European countries, is that the NATO summit declaration reaffirmed its commitment to support Ukraine. This is important because Trump was resisting, and it is learned that the European countries persuaded Trump to agree to this in return for their pledges to increase defense spending. And the last takeaway, which I think is very important, is that the Hague Summit declaration is not only brutally short, but it is focused entirely on portraying the alliance solely in terms of military capability and economic investment to sustain that. Now, NATO summit declarations since the Russian invasion of Ukraine had used the words, "We adhere to international law and to the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations and are committed to upholding the rules-based international order."
Okay.
The declaration published during the recent Hague Summit conspicuously does not mention either. There is no mention of international law this time. So, in short, what the recent NATO summit and the run-up to it has made increasingly clear is that the US and Europe are no longer perceive themselves as having a single enemy. Europe is focused more on Moscow as the major threat to international peace. But the increasingly bellicose China is perhaps demanding more attention from the US, and therefore their perceptions are not identical at all. In fact, they differ widely.
Okay. Wonderful, analysis out there in terms of what exactly happened at the recent NATO summit. Now, let me bring in Captain Alok Bansal here as well. Captain Bansal, NATO is one of the many multilateral forums in the world, and these forums are have become really important and significant with the passage of time and the weakening of the United Nations specifically, and NATO is just one of them. There are others as well. Now, since we are focused on NATO today, the question is, as Mr. Dayal was also mentioning, do you also see two things emerging here? One, that United States of America under President Trump seemingly has been able to have its say finally at the NATO forum. One, and two, as Mr. Dayal is saying, that NATO members, specifically the European bloc and United States of America, seems to have parted ways already. It's just yet to be formally announced.
See, firstly, I think post-Cold War itself, NATO was searching for a role for itself, because with the end of Cold War, to my mind, NATO's primary objective had become defunct. And when Soviet Union disintegrated, a lot of promises were made to Soviet Union, which actually resulted ultimately in Russia-Ukraine war. But it lingered on. NATO as an entity lingered on. It operated in Afghanistan, which was way beyond its charter of responsibilities as per the original charter. It did a lot of activities. But with the arrival of Trump in White House, there was actually a mortal threat to the continuation of NATO, because Trump pursues an extremely transactional foreign policy. And in that transactional foreign policy, there is no scope for international norms, international laws, and traditional foreign policy norms. When Trump starts targeting his own NATO allies, calling Canada as 51st province and Greenland as which is under Danish suzerainty, or sovereignty, you may like to say, as available to US will acquire it. For the first time, it's threatening NATO partners. Then subsequently, his spat with Zelensky actually clearly exposed how US and Europe were on different planes as far as Russia-Ukraine war was. And of course, as Ambassador Prabhu Dayal said, much before he came to power, he said that we are unnecessarily footing the Europeans' defense bill and therefore Europe should spend. Now, of course, one of the biggest pluses of this particular NATO summit is that all countries have agreed to raise their GDP defense expenditure to 5% of GDP, in which also they have classified the 3.5% will be on core defense expenditure and 1.5% on defense infrastructure and associated things. So, which is a significant thing. But what we are seeing is that increasingly we are seeing differences amongst NATO members on international issues. We saw what happened in Israel-Iran conflict. America entered the conflict. Many of its NATO allies had different views on it. Turkey actually criticized it. France took a pro-Iranian line. UK was US spokesperson trying to somehow play a middle ground. But you saw the Europeans and US were not on the same line. Now you look at other countries. When we look at Turkey and many of the NATO allies are on different planes in many of these issues because Turkey of late is seeing more of not itself as a European power, but as a Turkic power whose influence should spread across North Africa, Arabian Peninsula, and Central Asia. It actually wants to, it's probably striving to create a neo-Ottoman empire. You see in Armenia, Azerbaijan, Turkey supported Azerbaijan. And now you saw countries like France coming out openly and espousing support for Armenia. Similarly, we have seen between Greece and Turkey, of course, Cyprus has always been an issue. So I think if this Russia-Ukraine war was not going on, I think NATO's epitaph would have been written by Trump by now. But because there is a conflict where Europeans feel that there is an existential threat to their existence, the European countries are trying to hang along. And they know that they don't have the wherewithal as of now to take on Russia by themselves. So they have to bow in front of Trump. And that was very clearly visible in this NATO summit, that Europeans were falling one over the other to actually bow as far as Trump was concerned.
Okay. So clearly it looks like, a transactional route which has been adopted by President Trump seemingly is, yielding results for his administration, for United States of America, and the Europeans as of now are falling in line as well. But Mr. Dayal, before we come back to the European members of NATO, one very interesting observation which has been made by Captain Bansal is with respect to another, important element of NATO, that is Turkey. Now, Turkey has its own significance. One, both strategically, geopolitically, and two, as Captain Bansal was pointing out, it has its own agenda only, which perhaps doesn't align neither with Europe nor with the United States of America.
You're absolutely correct. Turkey stands out as a sore thumb. Frankly, the European countries are even wondering why Turkey had been allowed to be a part of NATO in the first place. Of course, the situation when NATO was set up and when Turkey was admitted at one stage was different because the Soviet threat was greater and therefore there was an effort to contain the Soviet Union. But now the geopolitics around Europe has changed and Turkey is in direct confrontation with a number of European countries. In fact, Turkey is seen as a country which is making trouble for many members. Of course, as regards Cyprus, Turkey already occupies 1/3 of the island, the northern part. But there are ongoing tensions with Greece. There are also tensions with several of the other countries in East Europe. So in this background, Turkey's mischievous global role is not hidden from anybody. And the countries which are members of NATO are also concerned why Turkey is in NATO any longer and whether something should be done to move it out. Now, let me mention that the European Union has not admitted Turkey, despite the very strenuous efforts which the Turks have made. They have kept Turkey out. So there may be a movement at some stage to somehow elbow out Turkey. I don't know whether in terms of the constitution of NATO, whether it's possible or not. But certainly Turkey stands out as a country which has policies which are divergent from those of the other members within Europe. And there is therefore great dislike for the Turkish position. Of course, as far as we are concerned, India, Turkey is a nuisance, and that is why we are distancing ourselves, because Turkey has supported Pakistan out and out,
Indeed.
and we are trying to develop friends with the neighbors of Turkey, such as Armenia, Greece, because we have a vision in regard to the India, Middle East, Europe economic corridor, where
Yes.
an entry point in the Eastern Mediterranean and close ties with the other Mediterranean countries would benefit us greatly.
Indeed, IMAC is really, really important and significant to us and the region itself as well, as you mentioned, Mr. Dayal. Now, going back to the European aspect of it, Captain Bansal, you were talking about how, in this summit, it was pretty evident that the European countries, which are members of NATO, seemingly have it clear in their mind that this seemingly is an existential crisis for them, existential threat for them. In turn, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and Russia is seemingly a problem number one for them, but they can't handle it themselves, so they need United States of America on their side. Now, the real question is that let's also look at how these different, individual countries are trying to align and manage their own affairs and world affairs as well. Their projection on the global platform: France, Germany, United Kingdom. These three major players, if we look at them, they have divergent views on almost every geopolitical issue.
See, there is no doubt that most European countries have divergent views, and but for Russia-Ukraine war, many of them would have gone their own ways. Even on Russia-Ukraine war, we have seen now countries like Hungary, etc., have now a different viewpoint of what should it be. As far as the three major powers of Europe are concerned, that's Germany, France, and UK. They've had their own viewpoints. France has always pursued, if you know historically from de Gaulle's time, when France did not contribute troops for NATO, was a non-contributing member, France pursued a quasi-independent foreign policy. France has generally pursued an independent foreign policy. And if you would have seen that during the Iran-Israel war, the French position was quite divergent from that of the US. And in fact, France is quite active in places like Armenia, etc., which are conflict zones, which have been traditional spheres of Russian influence, etc. But having said that, now when you look at UK, the domestic opinion is now quite anti-US. In fact, you see that there is a Labour government which should have, but the historical compulsions, historical foreign policy compulsions have dictated that UK has generally not taken a very, very radically different view from US. Even while being a part of the European triumvirate, which was actually negotiating, they've generally tried to take up very, very benign position vis-a-vis US. And that's been the case. But we need to say, Germany, of course, now under a new regime is, I think, is looking at it. Germany is, I think, economically the largest of these three countries, and it has to take, because eventually, if Europe has to break free of US, it is the German defense expenditure which will make a difference. And Germany is now building up its defense expenditure, and I think that's going to be critical. So as and when Germany emerges as a credible military power, which of course rings some alarm bells across Europe for historical reasons. But that would be a defining moment, because that is the time when Europe will break free. But incidentally, when we say that these three big European powers, we should remember that when we talk of NATO, the second largest country in terms of population is Turkey. The second largest country in terms of people under arms is Turkey. And it is the fourth largest country in terms of area or geography within NATO, and that is because Denmark includes the huge Greenland and Canada, again two vast territory. So if you actually look at it in military powers term, probably Turkey is far more important to NATO, in fact contributes far more troops to NATO than any of these European countries are concerned. So that is where the point is. And now of course what is happening is that we are seeing that in today's world different countries have their own stakes. And you can imagine what a country like Denmark would do when the US president visits Greenland without even informing Danish authorities or something like that. So obviously there have been huge infringement of many of the European countries' sovereignties, and which are actually giving birth to neo-nascent nationalist movements in many of these European countries. And that's
Okay.
actually, firstly, it's diluting the European Union and European bonding, which we have seen Brexit in UK's case, but in other countries also, there is now a certain movement that should we remain a part of EU. But more significantly, this movement is being directed against the United States. So
Okay.
you would in due course see fissures, domestic opinion is turning against US in many of these countries.
Okay. MS Dal, your viewpoints on that, as Captain Bansal is pointing out, and you were also earlier referring to that, these different countries from Europe which are part of NATO, and specifically we're talking about Germany, France, or United Kingdom, and there are others as well, but these are the major voices, and the way they are trying to coordinate their responses on some aspects, and in other aspects they have divergent views. Either they are trying to, just sort of nod around with the United States of America because they need USA right now. But the larger real question is that how long can this continue? And also, will European bloc, which is part of NATO right now, those European nations, will they be able to, stand up on their own, hold on their own to their, internal alliance if the need arises, minus United States of America, against whatever threat be it Russia or China or maybe something else?
Well, the message which has gone out from Trump has repeatedly been that the European countries must learn to stand on their own. And in fact, the recent NATO summit, by increasing defense spending, has also sent across a message that the European countries realize they have to stand on their own feet. Now, of course, there are some bigger players, as you said, like Germany, UK, and France. They will have to shoulder the greater burden of European security. Captain Bansal was also absolutely right in pointing out that Turkey can play a very substantial role. It has got a very large territory and also substantial military strength because of its large armed forces. The problem is that Turkey is seen as a country where human rights are not respected. In fact, the arrest and prolonged detention of the opposition leader, who was seen as somebody who could topple Erdogan, is not viewed favorably by the other European countries. So there are differences of opinion in regard to each other. Now, the fact is that Russia is seen as the biggest threat by the European countries as far as security is concerned. And this is why they have emphasized the importance of strengthening Ukraine's defenses. Now, Donald Trump naturally doesn't see eye to eye with the European countries. For him, the Russia-Ukraine conflict doesn't matter as directly as it does the European countries. Now, that is why we see at the recent summit, there were some bilateral meetings and Zelensky had one with Trump. And while no material agreements were made at the summit, but Zelensky somehow managed to save face and get away with something. Let me mention that the Ukrainian president seemed to receive what has been termed in the media as a consolation prize because Trump softened his tone on the conflict. And when, of course, he was asked questions about weaponry which Turkey needed, he said, this is all in short supply and we'll have to see when we can spare that. And as regards financial aid, Trump said, as far as money going from US is concerned, we'll see. So there was nothing very concrete that came out in terms of assistance from the United States to Ukraine. The European countries
were made.
But the European countries, for whom Ukraine matters much more, are forthcoming, and I understand in their bilateral interactions on the sidelines of the NATO summit, there were decisive moves made to strengthen Ukraine's defense capabilities in view of the recent escalation from the Russian side. We all know that there are so many reports about Russia's attacks having escalated, and there is this need which is felt among the European members to strengthen Ukraine's defense capabilities. So there are differing perceptions, but of course, as you said, the big players in amongst the European members of NATO, which is Germany, France, and UK, will have to be more proactive, because there's no doubt that the United States will be distancing itself under Trump to a great extent from the security affairs of Europe.
Okay, indeed. And Russia-Ukraine conflict is not the only one where it looks like that both the European partners and the United States of America in NATO are not seeing eye to eye with each other. In fact, the recent Israel-Iran conflict also brought out, differences within the NATO alliance member countries. Let's have a quick final word from Captain Alok Bansal on Captain Bansal on the future or the road ahead for NATO alliance in your understanding, given all these contradictions, conflicts of opinion on various wars being fought in different parts of the world, be it Russia versus Ukraine or Israel versus Iran, the way the geopolitical tensions are being handled, or the way the economic issues are also being taken care of, and the internal responsibility scenario also, where the USA is asking European partners to take more load in terms of money being spent rather than just enjoy the benefits.
See, there are numerous imponderables which we need to understand. Trump is pushing for cessation of Russia-Ukraine hostilities. Russia is trying to capture as much territory as is possible, because Russia's actions in past few months show clearly that they also know that this war cannot go indefinitely, because the more this war prolongs, it's neither good for Russia nor for Ukraine. So if this war ends, this spurt in European expenditure in defense may not be sustainable after a few years, because the public opinion changes very fast. So in that sort of a situation, you will find some differences. And if this sort of an existential threat from Russia does not exist, then the relevance of NATO would also recede to some extent. And so the future of NATO actually depends on a lot of factors. The second factor, which is very important, is we need to understand that Trump has got limited time. I think by next year, when the midterm elections take place, you may see in United States a hostile Congress, which may see Trump getting embroiled into domestic issues rather than focusing anymore on external issues. And that would create a bigger problem. So there are imponderables, but the future of NATO, to my mind, as it exists today, does not really look too bright. You are already seeing fissures. How long will it last? Today, the Europeans are happy hypothecating their security to the United States, but they have realized that in today's world, this cannot be done. And I think after the spat in White House between Zelensky and Trump, I think they have realized that, and they are trying to build up now their defenses. But the day Europe does not feel the threat from Russia, or they feel they are competent enough to deal with their security threats, you would see the transatlantic divide will deepen, and NATO as it exists today may be a piece of history. Okay. Its counterparts CETO and CENTO have become. We need to understand, when we had NATO, we also had Southeast Asian Treaty Organization, we had Central Treaty Organizations, but the other two outfits have actually been consigned to the dustbins of history. So the day this threat recedes, you will see probably the NATO also following the same path.
Okay, very interestingly put out there, Captain Bansal, that whether NATO will meet the same fate as CETO and CENTO as well. Not many would know about CETO and CENTO, points to ponder about for our viewers there. Try and understand as to what has transpired in the past also in the geopolitical scenario. But as succinctly, summed up by both of you, Mr. Dayal and Captain Bansal as well, interesting times ahead, both for NATO member countries, the United States of America, and the overall geopolitical scenario also, that if at all NATO disintegrates, then what is the next force or next multilateral forum which might try and fill the vacuum or the void which is created, or, will it further fuel the geopolitical tensions? We'll keep a very close watch here. Come back again with deep dive analysis by experts. Thank you so much once again, gentlemen, Mr. Dayal and Captain Bansal, for joining us. And viewers, you can stay tuned to Worldview and Dialogus for more such interesting conversations and analysis. Thank you.